What's up, guys? I hope you had a good weekend. No Formula One, of course, so for us it was all about the family, and as a result of that we had a great time. We really had an interesting weekend. Fireworks, of course, firework displays Saturday and Sunday night, so that was all good fun. Loads of good dog walks, but as ever there have been, even though there's been no F1 this weekend, loads of great questions come in to Ask Elvis. Thank you very much. I actually think some really good, really interesting questions this week, so really appreciate those. May as well get into it then, haven't we? Roll the sting. Okay, let's start with this one from Fiend at Left Footed on Twitter. He says, question for next week's Ask Elvis: what are installation laps for? It's a good question. You know, installation laps, we hear about them all the time. We see them the first time a car leaves on a start of a session, for example, beginning of FP1, Saturday morning again. There's an installation lap, and it's basically when the car goes out of the garage for the first time of that particular session, does a complete lap, comes back straight into the pits. The purpose for it is to check some systems on the car, is to check the mechanicals on the car. Of course, most of the time, certainly when it's been between a sort of between races and you're going out in the beginning of FP1, the car's been completely pulled apart into a million pieces, and that's the first time it's run on track in its, you know, reassembled condition. So they have to run it just to check everything's okay, make sure there's nothing obvious that's wrong with it. The driver can get a feel for the car, get himself comfortable, make sure his seating position's correct, his belts are right, pedal position, steering wheel, all of those kind of things. Make sure the driver comfort is all as he wants it. The team will run various systems checks over the course of that installation lap. So they'll run various tests that they can have embedded in the software. The things like the gearbox will go through a learning procedure of learning about each shift. So the driver will be instructed to go through every single gear shift on that particular installation lap, for example, again, so that the software within the car can learn the positions of all the gear changes around the racetrack. They'll do radio checks to make sure they've got radio coverage all the way around the entire lap, because at some circuits you can find parts of the racetrack where radio coverage is not quite as good as others. When they get the car back, they will, you know, the mechanics will get it back into the garage, have a good look over it just to make sure visually that there's nothing obvious, like no leaks, nothing like that, nothing come loose, nothing starting to break, nothing burning around the exhaust area, those kind of things. The engineers will look into the software and again look for any anomalies. The software will actually pick up its own anomalies, so they'll show if there's a spike, it'll be flashing at you on the screen, so you can't really miss it. So it's all about just checking and understanding that the car is working as it should before you then bolt a set of proper tyres on it and start thinking about a proper run plan. Start pushing the car more towards its limits. So the driver has to be happy, the mechanics and engineers have to be happy, and the car itself has to be happy that everything's working perfectly before you can really start to go for it and start to really learn some stuff during the course of that session. But a good question. Igor Sheepens asks this question about the mechanics in the garage. He says, what kind of info do mechanics hear through their headphones during a race? Are they getting all conversations with the drivers or only info that's purely for them, for example, pit stops? Well, that's another good question, and that's something that differs slightly at each team. And at my team at McLaren, that changed over the course of my time there. So we used to get everything. We used to hear the channel that your driver was on, and you'd get all of the information, the driver to the pits to the mechanic, to the drivers. You'd get any internal chat. Dogs, honestly. You'd get everything. But we had a situation, and I forget the race or the year now, but we had a situation where we had drivers talking on the radio. We had drivers talking on the radio, and the driver chat on the radio sort of overruled the chat from the pit wall telling the team, the mechanics, that they needed to come out for a pit stop. So there was so much conversation going on between the driver, or the driver had left his radio keyed open, and that basically took up the airwaves, meant that the team manager couldn't then call us out into the pit lane for a pit stop, and it was a problem. So from then on, they changed the system so that now most of the mechanics will only hear the chats from the pit wall to the mechanics. So the really crucial stuff about bringing them out for pit stops, that kind of thing. Now, of course, there are certain people in the team that need to hear everything. So when I was there in a more senior position, I would get everything, but I'd have 2 or 3 radios on my belt to be able to cover all channels. And I think, some teams do this differently, but the safest way to do things now, and I suspect most teams now follow this kind of protocol, is that the radio traffic from the pit wall to the mechanics, the really important stuff about calling the guys out for the pit stop at the last moment, that has to overrule every other piece of radio traffic. So either got to have a system that can do that, or that's the only traffic they get to hear. WM Ryan asks this one. He says, with reports this week that the 2019 Aero regs will cause a major drop in downforce and performance, does this give Red Bull an early advantage given that they've got superior Aero in their chassis? Well, it's another good one, and you might easily assume that, but the point here that you've got to remember is for 2019, everything changes. Everybody's going to have a brand new chassis and a different Aero concept. This is not just about lowering downforce, the 2019 regs. It's about completely changing the way that, in fact, wait there. I've just borrowed one of Rex's model cars. In fact, it's actually one of my old model cars, but Rex has borrowed it. So, the 2019 regs, the bit that I think you're talking about, the front wing, which is the bit that everyone's been talking about, that's the major change, mostly designed to stop the outwash potential. So, the current Formula 1 front wings don't look like this. The end plates much more angled outwards towards the outboard side of the front wheel, all designed to drag this airflow out here and drag the turbulent front wheel wake, the messy air coming off this front wheel as it turns, to drag that away from the car, out all the way out here. Takes away the turbulence, but it does cause big problems behind for the cars that follow, as we know about. So for 2019, the front wings are going, I don't know if you can see that, a bit more like this, where the end plates actually direct the airflow much more inboard. So most of the airflow will now come inboard through here, through the front suspension, pass along through the barge board area and then onto the underfloor and around the side pods and off towards the rear. Now, what that's going to mean is that it's not just a case of bolting on a new front wing to the current cars, of course. The whole Aero concept has to change. So all of this area around the barge boards changes, the area underneath the floor, underneath the centre section of the car changes, because the airflow has to be worked in a completely different way. So the whole concept has to be reimagined. And that means that whatever Red Bull have right now, or any other team, is almost insignificant and almost irrelevant to what will happen next year. Now, we know that Red Bull are very, very good traditionally aerodynamically, so we would imagine they will do a good job of these new regulations as well, but it's not directly relative to the Aero concept that they have now. So in answer to your question, I don't think it necessarily hands them an advantage. The bigger teams, of which Red Bull are one, will always have an advantage because of the resource they have, because of the expertise they have, the facilities that they have over and above the smaller teams. So I would still imagine that those teams are going to do a better, more refined job, certainly in the beginning, than some of the smaller teams. But whatever people are running now bears very little resemblance to what we'll see on the cars for 2019 and onwards. Right, now this one is a question that actually came up last week, and I missed it, unfortunately, in last week's Ask Elvis. But it's a relevant question, lots of people asked it. Refers to the Mexican Grand Prix. It comes from Brew, this one. He says, how can Max ask the team to turn down the engine if needed? I thought teams aren't allowed to change the engine anymore from the pit wall. Right, you're right, and it refers to a radio message that we all heard played out on the television, where the team were telling Max that they had turned down the engine towards the end of the race to protect it. Lots of you said, hang on, I thought the team can't turn the engine down from the pit wall. You're right, they can't. In the old days, the team used to be able to send signals from the pit wall to the car to adjust settings. That no longer is allowed. Only information from the car to the pit wall, not vice versa. So if they want to make a change like that, the team have to ask the driver to make the change, and that's exactly what happened. We didn't get all of that radio conversation, but the team asked Max to make a switch setting change on his steering wheel, probably a number of switch setting changes towards the end of the race. Max will have then duly done that, and then the team will have come on the radio to explain to Max exactly what has just happened, what they've just done. And one of those things was, we've just turned the engine down. What he means was, we've just turned the engine down by you turning that switch on the steering wheel. Not that we've done it from the pit wall themselves. Hope that makes sense. Michael Bielica asks this one. I was wondering why the F1 cars make a whistling sound when it's raining and not as much when it's dry. Is it due to different power unit settings, or could the humidity in the air actually have an impact on the sound? He says, which I doubt. Okay, so no, I think what you're referring to is actually the difference between the sound of the wet tyres and the dry tyres. And it is quite noticeable. The wet tyres, just because of their grooves, make a very different sound. And of course, they're always running over water. They're always dispersing water. And the sound of that at great speed of a Formula 1 car, close to 200 miles an hour, makes a very, very unique sound when it's raining. So that's what it is, much more so than anything else to do with power units or aero. Right, Dave Jarvis asks this one. He says, with limited testing, what's stopping teams from just making another car and running it at a secret location? There's loads of tracks out in the middle of nowhere. Interesting point. There are loads of tracks all over the place, but well, firstly, Formula 1 cars are pretty noisy. You would struggle, I think, to keep it a secret if you suddenly started running a Formula 1 car around a racetrack for a day, even if it was out in the middle of nowhere. And secondly, the effort and expense and effort involved in doing that, up against the consequences of being found out, which inevitably would happen at some point, are just not worth it. It's cheating, essentially, isn't it? And you know, I know we've had teams cheat in the past, but most of the time, whenever we get to a point of teams looking for an advantage, it's about interpretation of the rules, maybe bending the rules, pushing the limits a little bit. That would be outright cheating. And I just don't think that very rarely happens. It has happened in Formula 1, but it very rarely happens. And that's an expensive cheat. You need a whole separate test team. You need a whole separate car, of course. You need a power unit from somewhere. Where are you going to get your power unit to run it from? A whole set of trucks. I mean, it's not going to happen. It's interesting, but it's not going to happen. There are much other ways that teams can look for advantages, more legal ways than trying to do that, I'm afraid. Okay, I think that was all I had for... Oh, hang on. Oh, here's one more. Let's finish on this one. And this one comes from Richard Valk, and he says, an idea for Red Bull next year. Now the top 3 teams can go through the back markers so easily, which makes them always minimally into the top 6. Why not take a new engine each race so you can really turn it up and make the difference, so you can overtake the Ferrari and Mercedes as well as they choose to conserve the engines? So that's an interesting thought, isn't it? We've got this situation now where, yeah, you're right, any of the top 3 teams can start last and will almost certainly guarantee to make it past all the midfield and get into the top 6 by the end of the race. So if you took a brand new engine each race, took the penalties associated with that, but we're able to turn it up as a one race only engine, could that performance advantage give you enough to then get past, if you're a Red Bull for example, to get past the Ferraris or the Mercedes? Well, that's an interesting thought. My first reaction is I don't think you could, by turning the engine up even, I don't think you'd have enough to reach and get past the Ferrari and the Mercedes. Don't forget, if Mercedes and Ferrari are running a normal race, if you like, starting at the front, they're pulling out a huge gap, they're running their own race. If you're having to spend 3/4 of the race fighting your way through the field, destroying tyres as you go, chasing through back markers, hoping that you can get through cleanly, avoiding all of the mess at the start that inevitably happens at the start of a race when you're near the back, if you can get through all of that, could you still have enough then, to once you've cleared the midfield, to then be able to chase down the Ferraris and the Mercedes that must have built a substantial gap by that point? I'm not sure. It seems like a huge risk to me. You're putting yourself at huge risk. But it's an interesting concept. You know, if you're looking at last race of the season with nothing too much to lose, throw a new engine in, take the penalties. There's nothing really stopping the teams from doing that, and that's maybe something that, if it were to happen, the FIA could introduce another line within the regs to somehow prevent that. But it's an interesting thought, and it's not something I'd thought about before. I just don't think that any team would be willing to take the risks associated with that on a regular basis to try and make it work. But maybe last race of the year, never know. Right, thanks guys, thank you so much. I thought some really good ones. I hope you enjoyed that. Some nice questions this week. So thanks very much. Don't forget to like the video, please. I appreciate that. Share it around to all of your mates. Hit subscribe if you're not... That's the postman has just arrived. Hit subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and hit the little bell down here in the corner, which will notify you every time a new video goes live. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. See you tomorrow.